This is Nick Burnette with CyberShorts Episode 3, The Psychic of 5th and Union Street, read by Nick Burnette. In the sidewalk-beating heart of New Seattle City, there was a small sanctuary, about the size of an apartment kitchen. The St. Herdes sanctuary was a 10-foot-wide hall of worship adorned with a small bench. The bench was facing a statue of Mary shielded behind plexiglass. There were candles, shriveling flowers, and a used condom. One person could easily get that quick dose of Catholicism they needed before going about their day. Two people would have to be friends to fit inside. Above it was an equally small residence where a psychic lived. There were two more apartments above his, tucked into this quaint building corner where every police siren or gunshot sang loudly. He wasn't really a psychic, at least he didn't think so. When Fernando was born, the third child of a struggling family, he had poor vision and received the cheapest cybernetic implants available. After the pain and the cost, they somehow didn't work, but he was a kid and could pass his vision tests, so that was it. He eventually convinced his parents that there was a problem and ended up with some replacements a few years later. Funny thing, the new implants didn't work either. They were just as buggy, and the images were just as distorted at times. Not always, just random visual aberrations which worsened when doing menial chores. Once as a teenager, he was washing windows downtown, doing little jobs to feed himself that day, when the next thing he knew he was shielding his eyes. The sidewalk was glowing and shaking. When it stopped, he cursed his cybernetics for needing an update, and then stared in shock at the people loitering along the street. What looked to be ordinary foot traffic sent a chill down Fernando's spine, though he couldn't exactly say why. He just ran behind the alley, and a few moments later, gunfire erupted. Another time, now as a young man, he'd been delivering takeout. On one delivery, the customer, a lady in her 30s, made his cybernetics glitch out so bad he had to hold the door. Her buttons of her blouse were highlighted and her hair was tousled and loose, and her lips were beaming in his vision. He soon found himself inside her room with the doors closed, a willing victim of being undressed. As time went on, he realized a pattern with these glitches. Soon he attempted to piece together what his brain and cybernetics were telling him, with limited success. Clothing, door handles, numbers, and even stains would vibrate or jump at him, making riddles he couldn't decipher. When he could decipher them, like one time that he told a guy not to go home, it changed the events to be. Of course, telling a stranger not to go home earned you the crazy glare, but the guy must have listened. 2 days later, he tracked Fernando down and demanded to know if he was involved, and all Fernando could say was, "I just knew." The unknown aura of reputation grew from events like this. That reputation swelled in the months to follow until a sort of fame had been reached. There was a psychic among the people, but nobody knew him. One evening he descended the stairs from his little apartment above the sanctuary. He glanced inside at Mother Mary and found letters, which was strange because people usually prayed at churches. When he picked one up, he realized the letters were for him. People had gone to their place of hope to leave letters that had no address, accidentally delivering them perfectly to Fernando. It gave him paranoia at first, thinking people had followed him home, but after reading a handful he realized the coincidence. They'd left the letters at a church, not knowing where to send them, hoping their faith would do the rest. It did. Today, Fernando was crossing the street to his usual dinner market when a sickly feeling rumbled across his stomach. His optics were swirling and he staggered, suddenly struggling to get across the road. He got to the sidewalk and gripped a street pole while the vertigo subsided. "Damn drunks," someone cursed as Fernando held on in agony. He blinked and fought to control the signals beaming in his optics, impossible to ignore even with his eyes closed. When the swirling lights and shaking pictures settled, his vision displayed a series of glowing shoe prints departing the mini-mart. Thinking them important, he followed the shoe prints. He stumbled after and came around the corner, and found the trail of shoe prints as they continued to a man creating them. The nausea came once more, and nothing about this man caused Fernando to feel okay. Fernando followed the footprints, holding his stomach as he did. The man walked a couple of blocks and towards the natural harbor. He was carrying a small bag of groceries from the market, and Fernando couldn't look at it, not even for a second without doubling over in pain. Eager to understand this sudden overload of optic signals, he backtracked to what he remembered last. The nausea had begun as soon as he approached the store. Whatever was going on, It had to do with this man. Fernando followed the man a block towards the water, then another as New Seattle City morphed from a stretch of markets and boutiques into pungent factories and fish plants. The mystery man continued deeper and then went down an alley towards Mac's Meadery. Conveniently located in the heart of the industrial stretch, Mac's Meadery was a canning business that had famously fed the city during the war embargoes about 30 years ago. Its glory days behind it, Mac's Meadery was a running joke now, though Fernando himself had the occasional can of mystery meat. The entire factory was in need of a power wash and likely pest control, but it continued canning its mystery meat, distributing throughout the city. Fernando came to an abrupt halt as the man walked in through the loading doors in the back alley. He worked here, and for a moment Fernando figured the chase was over. A handful of employees huddled to his left, and not one of them looked up at Fernando. The smell of rot was almost as strong as his optics moments earlier, but the employees were unfazed. How did someone get used to this ungodly smell? The fact he'd eaten a can from here not that long ago threatened to send him to the toilet, and he knew without thought that he'd never eat one again, not after smelling this. Fernando focused his senses on calming down and continuing the pursuit. The man was out of sight, but his shoe prints were still glowing in Fernando's optics, leaving a fading trail down the hall and to the left. Somehow where his feet touched was plainly visible to Fernando. Fernando pursued and stopped as the man came into view. The room had opened into a warehouse full of vats, burbling and steaming with various stages of meat processing. The man approached one of the ingredient vats, which was badly in need of scrubbing and bleaching. How could they in good conscience feed this to people? He fought the disgust and watched as the man looked around before retrieving something from his grocery bag. The sinking feeling Fernando had came to realization when he saw a bottle of Terax. It was a pest repellent that had done an overly efficient job of eliminating cockroaches and bedbugs, and customers learned you never wanted to touch it with your bare skin or let it go down a storm drain. Even in a modern and free New Seattle City, people were calling to have Terax banned. This man was about to pour the bottle into a vat. "Stop!" Fernando ordered. The man turned and looked at Fernando, with a glare that sent nameless warnings. He threw the bottle in and bolted as Fernando gave chase. "What the hell's going on over here?" Shouts followed him. The man was fast, and Fernando was far from a physical specimen, so he ran for the buttons near the vat instead and slapped the emergency stop button, which hid behind a layer of meat proteins. The vat sputtered as some gears came to a halt. Fernando was grabbed by the scruff of his neck and dragged from the vats as employees swarmed around him. Shouts and curses, somewhere in there were demands for explanations. Others were about falling behind on daily production. "It's contaminated!" Fernando screamed, which garnered laughs. They'd heard that one before, apparently. He climbed up and reached his hand into the unspeakable conglomeration of protein mush and pulled out the bottle of Terax, which garnered swift gasps. A supervisor pulled him into a room with oily seats that Fernando wished he'd known about before sitting down. Before explaining the glowing shoes and sick feeling, he knew from past experience that people didn't respond well to his unique abilities. I overheard him muttering. He was disgruntled, and I just didn't like the way he was acting in the store. It sounded like he wanted to poison the food production, so I followed him, not knowing what to do, Fernando said. Mostly lies, he'd never made it inside the store, but it was a lie that made sense, more sense than the truth would have. Fernando gathered the man's name was Tim, and he'd been on report for attendance issues and starting fights with other employees. The supervisor ordered the vat to be dumped and sprayed, garnering a reluctant shrug from the employee receiving the message. Eventually, Fernando went home and forgot about the incident, crawling to bed and closing his eyes for sleep. Despite all of his perceptive gifts, his mind had become numb to sensory signals as he lay down to sleep above the city sanctuary. Fernando awoke with a burning cough as smoke filled his room. He sprang upright and found pummeling swirls filling his ceiling. Another coughing fit as he rolled out of bed in his underwear, the floor intensely warm. A fire! He had seconds to do something and he knew it. The window was his first thought, but there was something about the angle of that fire escape, and by something, he meant that it was flashing through his optics, a message in any language. He only had a millisecond to wonder why, but he trusted his optics. That left the stairs, and despite the flames and plumes of smoke, he dove down them. Elbows in tight and feet light with adrenaline, he dashed forward into heat and flames, letting his optics lead the way. With help from his cybernetics, he bounded through the stairway to the sanctuary beneath. He was outside now and looked up to survey the scene, while a tenant above him climbed out their window to the fire escape. Fernando noticed the burns on him, wondering why he didn't just use the fire escape. Then a snap, and the fire escape came tumbling loose. The tenant held on but met a swift splattering fate on the street below. Fernando looked away at the last second, but he still heard it, and that's when he met eyes with Tim, the employee with the tear axe. He held some sort of tool bag. A look of frustration on Tim. Fernando realized why. Tim walked towards the almost naked psychic, who was paralyzed in fear. A curved blade appeared from the tool bag, a kind Fernando had seen before but didn't know its name. He was planning to kill him right there in front of everyone, and it was the kind of city that would let him and talk about it later. The howling of sirens and swirling emergency lights came up behind Fernando. The fire department arrived to squash the blaze. When Fernando looked up again, Tim and his curved knife were gone. I have to move, Fernando realized. He had an enemy now. For what? He was just trying to help people. Guess that upset Tim, the psychopath. How twisted do you have to be to poison hundreds of people you don't even know? What pleasure comes from that? Fernando could understand some types of murder, though he'd never commit them. They at least made sense. Your girl was cheating on you. You wanted to rob a place for money and someone got hurt. Despicable, but threads of logic at least. You had a bad day, so you want to poison 100 people you never met? It just made no sense to Fernando. And now this sick bastard had a grudge. I have to call the police, Fernando said to himself. He could tell them all about how Tim is trying to kill him, get him locked up for starting that fire. But they'd also wonder how Fernando knew, just like the supervisors at the canned meat factory wanted to know. Something told him lying to a detective would get sniffed out pretty quick. But the truth would get him locked up with the crazies. He started to shiver as firemen jostled around him. Eventually someone, maybe a neighbor, draped a blanket over him. Who did he know that he could turn to? No one. He had no one. Fernando fell to his knees. He had nowhere to go. His money was burned up, his clothes, his journals. He was just trying to help people. Hey, you're a psychic. Sort of. Find someone, he thought. Sure, maybe. If he put his mind to looking, there had to be someone that could help him. He just needed to find that person before Tim found him.